Hello and welcome to Salon number 85, The Gift of Food with Indigo Pinedo and Bhanu Natarajan, hosted by Genevieve Vaughan and the International Feminists for a Gift Economy. I'm Letecia Layson, your moderator. I'm going to start out with some short introductions to our guests, and then each of them will speak. We'll take questions. Liliana and Judith will read your questions out for Bhanu and Indigo. So let's just begin. Our first speaker today is Indigo Pineda. She's a 24-year-old Cuban-American non-binary student at the American University of Rome, pursuing an MA in Food Studies, Sustainable Production, and Consumption Policy. Their background is highly diverse, with experience from their bachelor's degree in creative writing and entrepreneurship, a diploma in professional pastry arts, various sustainability communication roles, and managing farmers markets. You can learn more about their projects and work at Indigo Pinedo, my Canva site. She currently is in Rome, or they are currently in Rome, working on their thesis, which proposes a novel indigenous matriarchal approach to the UN Committee on World Food Security. We are really, really excited to have her and for her to present what she has to offer to us in just a moment. Our second speaker is Bhanu Natarajan. Bhanu holds a master's degree in biology with research experience in ethnobiology from the University of Oslo. She has published academic papers, popular science articles, and newspaper columns. Over the past 13 years, she's been actively involved in biodiversity issues, including founding a local environmental group. Through this group, she has raised awareness among school children and the local community about the importance of biodiversity. In addition, she is passionate about teaching and conducting courses on vegetarian cooking with a focus on environmental sustainability and health. She also contributes articles on vegetarian food to the local newspaper, promoting sustainable dietary habits. She's active with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in Norway and working on issues related to the environment. Thank you both for joining us, and I would like to welcome Indigo to begin. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for this amazing introduction and for the invitation to participate in this salon. This is my first kind of official talk, kind of going into this field and this new field that, I started pursuing after my bachelor's. So it's very exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time. So forgive me if I stutter a little bit and trip over my words. And I also want to, honor all of the people who have come before me and pursuing this movement and contributing to what has made this field so interesting and unique and multi-sectoral and transdisciplinary. So I come from a very high-level perspective with my master's degree in specifically sustainable production and consumption policy relating to food. And that's what my research is focused on. And I understand that when we look at high-level policymaking spaces, they are definitely not reflective of the maternal gift economy frameworks, of matriarchal frameworks, of indigenous frameworks, and ways of knowing. And a lot of my thesis is deconstructing this and looking at the weaknesses that are present within these systems, and especially the UN Committee on World Food Security. And that a lot of that dissection happens when we're looking at human rights frameworks, right? Especially the most important related to this topic is the right to food, which is kind of bundled under a lot of different human rights frameworks. But it kind of started gaining a little bit more traction in the mid-1990s. And a lot of these human rights frameworks, when it relates to food and nutrition and food security, they frame food as an object and a commodity, and always as something that has tangible, deliverable qualities, simply physical qualities, right? And a lot of these frameworks and policy products that the UN produces, that other large international legislative bodies produce, operate within this very production forward mindset informed by the neoliberal trade policy and profit driven incentives that have kind of dominated food systems since I guess the age of colonialism, really, and into its adaptation into capitalism, and what we saw with the mass deregulation in the 1980s, and the Green Revolution is what we call it, in the 1970s, that Vandana Shiva talks about, if you're familiar with her work. Um, and the Green Revolution, kind of expanded this idea of industrial agriculture and industrial food systems that we see are pretty much dominating our food systems across the world today. But considering all of this context, is very evident in all of the language that they use, right? It's all of the policy products specifically related to women in food systems focus solely on their productive value. And they're growing to acknowledge the inequalities that women face and that marginalized peoples face in food systems, but they're not specifically addressing the systemic structures that reproduce these inequalities and these mindsets that reproduce inequalities for women, marginalized people, indigenous peoples. And that happens to be patriarchy, capitalism, the long-term effects of colonialism, and still persistent colonialism in some places. And when we see these policy products, put out on these international platforms, for member states, as we call them, or countries to take up on, we see that the way these policies kind of trickle down and translate often misconstrues the ultimate aims of the policy products, because they're trying to tailor it to their own context, which tends to be heavily informed by their kind of dominant narrative that they want to uphold about their country, that has to kind of be in line with neoliberal trade policy and profit-driven incentives, in order to kind of gain recognition and status among the other member states, right? And these processes where they're making these policy products, this discursive translation process, as we call it, in policy spaces, don't acknowledge indigenous ways of knowing and different worldviews and food system activities that aren't specifically, monocrop production, right? And that often, despite the intent, these policies, when they're not built with this indigenous mindsets, these minority mindsets, and these people present in their policymaking spaces, they often end up promote policy that actually harms marginalized people even more. And the way that we see this occurring in food systems, specifically in the context of the CFS, is we have a civil society mechanism that encompasses indigenous peoples and farmers and fisher folk and pretty much actors from all over the food system, except for the private sector mechanism fully. And the private sector tends to look like corporations like Nestle and Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, those ones that we see very frequently in multi-stakeholder processes. But these kind of spaces tend to give more voice to the private sector mechanism than the civil society mechanisms, because they're labeled as extreme or extremists. And we're seeing the growing movements of agroecology and food sovereignty becoming even more present in these spaces, which is kind of causing this radicalization and this step back from member states who are like, oh, this is too political. And, to the average person, we're like, oh, well, this is a policymaking space for food, which is something that affects everyone. It should be political, right? But when we see these multi-stakeholder processes and private sector kind of weaseling their way in, they're kind of suspending this dominant narrative of, oh, we need scientific evidence that's based on empirical statistics, and rather than the lived experiences of people in their own food systems, in their own very unique contexts. And so that's what the civil society mechanism is enabling with advocates for agroecology and food sovereignty. because this platform inherently is built to give them a voice, even if it is often ignored. But these movements are pushing for sustainable food systems, and not just in terms of environmental sustainability, but food systems that are free from corporate capture and the neoliberal endless growth paradigm, and focusing on local adaptations and uplifting local economies, which often we see are gift economies in indigenous contexts around the world. And even though we still face pushback from a lot of nations and even the convention facilitators who are kind of mentally entrenched in this neoliberal market paradigm, we do see a kind of gradual acknowledgement that there is a shift between, we don't like that our food systems are being captured by corporations, so we need to retranslate what food means, right? Um, and that's where the main point of what I wanted to talk about comes in. How do we shift this idea of food as a commodity, food as a physical product, and solely a physical product, into food as a gift, so something that can be considered commons? And my research has revealed that it can come about in many different ways. This could be through multiscalar education, which focuses on the value of food systems in terms of their cultural significance, and introducing and centering indigenous knowledges that engender communalism, interconnectedness, care, and the inherent value of people outside of their productive value, right? This is where education is where we start seeing this little shift, right? And when I talk about multi-scalar education, this isn't just something that happens on the ground, right? Well, grassroots movements are important, and I'll get into that in a little bit. We need to introduce this education to multiple different levels of food systems governance in order for it to actually kind of gain a little bit of traction as an alternative to the way that current food systems are being managed. And we can see this through a lot of NGOs are taking on what we call gender transformative approaches. And gender transformative approaches are different from what a lot of development NGOs tend to go for, because it doesn't just accommodate women where they're at, it seeks to transform the social paradigm within the context to critically reassess what stereotypes or norms are constantly reproducing these inequalities that we see in food systems. And a lot of that has to do with patriarchy and capitalism, and they're not often directly stated, but it's super obvious from the data that we see from these NGOs, right? They're not that like there's a lot of fear around actually stating the words gift economy, even though they're like, oh, it's subsistence. Well, it's also gift. Often it's also gift, and they don't want to acknowledge it. So when we take, these data and indicators, we also have to kind of use the language that actually represents them, rather than trying to pick apart and piece by piece. Okay, well, it kind of shows traits of what a matrilineal economy looks like, or it kind of shows traits of what matrilocality looks like. We need to start creating an abundance of language within this multi-scale education. So it's not going to happen just at the grassroots level, it's going to happen at NGO level through organizational education and restructuring. It's also going to happen eventually it's going to kind of work its way up to an international policymaking level. We just need time. And it not only does it need to be multi-scalar, it also needs to be cross-sectoral, right? And this often occurs through a collaboration of movements, right? We see that Indigenous rights movements are very closely tied to food sovereignty movements, to agroecology movements, because they have the same kind of goals of removing their food systems from corporate capture and redefining them for themselves as subsistence or as gift economies. And I think when we coming back to the expansion of language and this cross-sectoral collaboration, this allows for more language to kind of disperse among these spaces. So we can start having an expanded vocabulary that takes into account multiple different worldviews, or what I often refer to as a pluralistic epistemology. or plural epistemologies. And part of this language expansion is expanding our idea of food as a commodity into food as a gift, into seeing, okay, how does food contribute to our belonging, our cultural identity? And how do we make language that will be translated into governance, into local policy that reflects this, that reflects this nuance, right? And we see actually pushes towards it with within the CFS. We see the Committee on World Food Security, they have this mechanism called the High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Security and Nutrition. And recently they have been noting food sovereignty movements. They had a whole paper on agroecology and the importance of that movement for reducing inequalities in food systems and for recognizing alternative economies. And they also have frequently introduced the idea of a six-dimensional definition of food security, right? And so the basic definition of food security is very focused on the productive value and making sure people have enough quality and quantity, but it hasn't been expanded into kind of the cultural aspects or the social aspects of what creates food security until the six-dimensional definition came out. By my advisor, actually, she was one of the authors, and she introduced me to this topic, and I was like, this is revolutionary. They added two different kind of pillars to the original four-pillar definition, which is agency and sustainability. And agency is probably the key factor within this, because agency takes into account, okay, how much do people have control over their own food environments, right? How much do they have a say in how their own food systems and how their own diets are determined, right? And we see this often in food deserts where food security might be high because they have an abundance of unhealthy foods, but they don't have the agency to determine, okay, well, I don't want a burger today. I want an affordable vegetable-based meal, right? But they don't have the access to the political spaces or to, be in direct contact with the corporations who have dominated these food deserts and saturated these food deserts with unhealthy food. All this to say, we need to have an education that is cross-sectoral in not just the ways of expanding in between different movements, but also educating people on how to advocate for their own human rights, which is what you have the right to food security under human rights international law, right? But how to advocate for your own human rights in political spaces, in your community spaces, right? Learn how to share this language with other people so they are also enabled to express their rights to their fullest abilities. And we oh my gosh, sorry, I lost myself in my notes real quick. Oh, okay. So in these community spaces, they often look like community gardens or food pantries or renewing or supporting the traditions of food gifting, like we see with the renewal of potlatch ceremonies across Native Americans and First Nations peoples in the land now called Canada. And these spaces are kind of enablers of expanding this language and expanding our ideas of how should we advocate for our rights and what's the language we can use to best advocate for our rights and expand the levels of agency that we have over our own food systems. And this expanded language inherently includes looking at people as the core element of food systems, right? Food systems have constantly been around. Let's produce more and more and more food, but it hasn't been about how are we going to safeguard the people and promote the health and the well-being of peoples within their own food systems. And these spaces actually enable us to build community, to take care of each other, to expand this language, and to coalesce into greater movements like we see with agroecology and food sovereignty, which often seem too big for us to kind of comprehend because they're already multinational. But kind of the key to all of this is thinking globally but acting locally, which is a very common phrase in sustainability spaces. But ultimately, if we want to create higher level change within expanding our ideas of food as a gift, it has to come from this community level, these grassroots levels. And documenting this is insanely important, right? And documenting the success factors. Okay, we were able to ensure food security for this many households in my community. That's kind of the key factor. And also taking real life stories. Storytelling is one of the most important tools for expanding our definitions and expanding the advocacy and promotion of our rights. And we've already made good traction. As of a couple days ago, I think September 30th, Cuba just recognized agroecology into law, right? Which inherently protects food systems, protects the people who are participating in their food systems and building local subsistence and becoming independent from the corporations that have technically dominated the food systems all over the world. Cuba's in a particularly good position for this because they have been kind of cloistered from the rest of the world in terms of food systems trade. So they haven't had that neoliberal paradigm as heavily as other countries have. But this shows a really great start towards building these communities. And they also have great practices regarding urban agriculture and community gardens. And the enshrining of agroecology into law wouldn't have been possible without all of these efforts, right? And I think that kind of summarizes what my research has found. And, I want to really emphasize the kind of think globally, act locally aspect of it. Because no matter what your effort is, no matter how small, if you're just producing, let's say a stalk of green beans in your backyard, that is so much better than relying on canned green beans from the grocery store that have traveled all over the world and you have no connection to the people who actually grew them, right? And building community by talking to your local farmers, going to the farmers market. And a lot like what Bhanu does, teaching people about food as medicine and expanding our definition of what vegetarianism and vegan cooking looks like, right? It all starts there, and eventually that changes people's minds as communities grow, as our idea of food as a commodity is transformed into something that's no longer necessary for us to survive in this world. That's it. Thank you.
Indigo, thank you so much. That was a beautiful first step out. You did a great job. I'm sure we'll have some questions, but you did a beautiful segue into Bhanu's talk, and then we'll have more conversation with you. So thank you so much for that great talk. Bhanu, could you please unmute and begin?
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity and introduction, and greetings to everyone. I just wanted to add that I first came across the gift economy when I met Jen in Norway in 2002. So since then, I've been very conscious about this in most of the things I do. So my presentation today will deal with women's role in food and biodiversity from a gift giving and subsistence perspective. Towards the end, I'll also talk a little about my involvement in teaching vegetarian cooking that relates to these perspectives. It's well known that women have been custodians of natural resources. Their role in management and conservation is as old as agriculture itself. The management of natural resources has helped in the conservation of a variety of plants, useful in day-to-day life, that covers households' needs, mainly food for the family and for domestic animals, medicines, craft, building materials, trade, spiritual practices, and many more. Knowledge of natural resources It's usually passed on by word of mouth from one generation to another. We are very much aware of the use of natural resources in medicine, but women are also involved in preparation of food and passing on culinary traditions, where they use a wide variety of species that helps to maintain culture and biodiversity. So what is biodiversity? It is the sum of a variety of species found on Earth that includes genes, species, and ecosystems they form part of. In other words, when we talk about biodiversity, it's also species, ecosystems, and genes. And to put it simply, it's all life on Earth. However, we are losing this biodiversity due to climate change, release of greenhouse gases, habitat destruction, agricultural expansion, war, and pollution, to name a few. Take agriculture, for instance. In today's world, increasingly, few species account for a large amount of global crop production. Rice, wheat, and maize amount to more than 50% of calories consumed, which come from these plant resources. In other words, we rely on a very narrow set of crops and monoculture production that make it vulnerable to pests, diseases, and extremes of climate. Largely modern agriculture contributes to habitat destruction and loss of species. It's also responsible in polluting soils and waterways. Habitat loss is one single activity that tops in the enormous change in landscape and leads to disruption of ecosystems with serious consequences for diversity. Pollinators disappear. As a result, agricultural land gets degraded. Just want to say, I don't know how many of you saw this program on Al Jazeera just this week about the deserts. I mean, all this date cultivation in Iraq have been destroyed. All the pollinators are gone because there's no water left. Decline in biodiversity means fewer nutrient-rich foods. So we have fewer nutrient-rich foods such as vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds that are rich in antioxidants and vitamins. This also means poor nutrition among people and other living creatures. The other creatures also need healthy food, not just the humans. Loss of biodiversity impacts our health and also the health of the planet. The few species that dominate our dining table and our diet, it has become homogeneous with serious health consequences for both humans and our planet. So when it comes to women's role, as I mentioned in the beginning, the old cultures where women have managed their land and its resources, and they have a deep understanding of how nature functions and deep respect for natural resources. They grew diverse plants for food, for themselves and for their animals, following agroecological principles, as Indigo mentioned earlier. That is, taking into consideration both the resource and the ecology. They had control of crops that were cultivated, and that gave them autonomy and status, and they were independent of men. These agricultural economies considered nature as gift of Mother Nature and was freely shared among the community. With the march of industrialization and modern agriculture, these economies and ways of managing farms and resources changed for the benefit of profit maximization, a sole feature of the modern capitalist economy. As Indigo also mentioned, land was privatized. This also meant that women were removed from their subsistence production and management. They lost their independence and became just an extra hand in labor in the production of food. Since colonial times, indigenous peoples too were robbed of their lands, and their traditional practices were destroyed during the colonization process. Women and other indigenous peoples effectively lost control of their land and thereby access to natural resources and their status. As we all know, in the dominant capitalist paradigm, women and nature are viewed as two separate entities. This dualism has had dire consequences for both women and nature, as I mentioned earlier, what we are witnessing today, the crisis, climate crisis. Whereas in traditional societies, women and nature were considered as an integral part of both sustainability and gift giving. The coexistence is recognized also in the ecofeminist thought. The capitalist development is also defined by Ben Holt Thompson and Maria Mies as housewifeization, where women's work and their contributions are made invisible. And it is for the capitalists to take advantage of and exploit what they provide as gifts for the common good. When it comes to gift economy, Genevieve says all the time, the capitalist economy is a parasite on all resources. I like this sentence very much, that it can profit by, whereas the gifts aspects and their economies are ignored. Of course, many communities practice gift giving and they exist in pockets today. I hope they don't just vanish. The biodiversity and traditionals associated with it is there free for the companies to monopolize and profit from. We need to bring our focus on the gift aspects, and then there would be room for sharing of natural resources and enhancing social relations arising from biodiversity. When it comes to the subsistence perspective, this also recognizes both life-creating and life-giving initiatives, that is, human contributions and nature's contributions. In the context of food, one can say how women use their traditional knowledge that is put to use in farming and its produce, thus creating life-nourishing food and enhancing community life and sharing of resources. Subsistence also emphasizes self-reliance. And this is what we lack, and this is what is being taken advantage of by the corporations today. Biodiversity, traditional knowledge and competence that exists in communities fit well into both the gift economy and the subsistence perspectives, where nature and human interactions with its benefits in communities and respects the planet as well. So when we talk of food, what is food? Where does it come from? Where do women stand when it comes to food? These days, when we talk of food, we see on the TV, chefs, they're all men teaching how to cook, for example. But food encompasses many aspects. Food nourishes all living beings in many ways. It is embedded in people's culture, represents relationships, comfort, care, social connections, traditions, spirituality, and identity. It also involves all branches of modern science: psychology, behavioral science, social science, consumer behavior. All this, the corporations are very clever in adopting and creating products that attract people to buy their products. It involves also nutrition, biology, and medical sciences. We are very much aware of women's contributions and the use of natural resources in medicine. Again, women are involved in preparation of food and passing on the culinary tradition that help maintain both culture and diversity. No species goes to waste. They know how to use everything around them. All species are considered useful. I just wanted to give an example of, especially in the West, a classic example, which we see as food covers many columns in the newspapers, discussion forums, and practical cooking scene on the YouTube. If you have a garden, you should get rid of weeds. One example is the dandelion. Poor dandelion. People use chemicals or herbicides to remove. They stand there for several hours and have a wonderful garden with just green grass. And they have to mow them all the time, mow the lawn. In addition, there are many garden gadgets which you can use to get rid of the same. But the poor dandelion has very good characteristics. It is loaded with antioxidants, minerals, and fiber. It is a useful herb which contains, among others, vitamin C. It also adds color to your plate. The leaves are used as salads or as spinach and cooked raw, eaten raw or cooked. The flowers are used in tea or to make wine. The whole plant is useful. It has a lot of medicinal properties. The nectar of flowers is food for the bees and bumblebees. Unfortunately, the dandelions are an anathema for modern gardening and for industrial agriculture, as they are considered as weeds, thereby not useful and should be removed. So I'll hop over to this vegetarian food, the activity which I'm involved in. I'm not a chef, or I don't have a formal education in cookery, but have basic knowledge of how to make food. I'm sure every one of us know how to make food. There are many advantages of making food on your own. You get fresh food. You will learn to observe and see qualities of raw materials, in that you can see and taste the finished products. A dish, for example, how the resource is transformed into an edible dish. You develop a relationship with the resource, and that can bring us a long way towards appreciating these culinary techniques. And these days, there are a lot of discussion about ultra-processed foods. That is not good for health. One takes in chemicals such as preservatives that is unnecessary for our bodies. With homemade food, one can avoid ingesting these preservatives and other chemicals. These classes that I offer are a gift economy in practice. I do not charge for my time or services, although we get some funds from the commune that goes for renting a kitchen or other things that cost. Participants share the cost of ingredients, which is a fee for the course. Furthermore, these courses are a step in subsistent orientation, in that it can offer tools in the choice of ingredients, whether it is vegetables, spices, fruits, beans, and cooking can be a rewarding experience towards nourishment and health and self-reliance. Remember, diversity is the key to resilience. Just as our body needs diverse foods, nature too needs biodiversity to keep her ecosystem and habitats in check and allow biodiversity to thrive. This way, you can take care and provide for your family, yourself, and nature. Many may think what I have spoken about my activity is utopia. Food preparation does not necessarily take a long time. I think it's a misunderstanding, probably created by all this, media and social media, TikTok and whatnot. But through this initiative, I hope we can revive practical skills and appreciate how subsistence perspectives towards self-reliance and appreciate the gifts that nature has to offer us can be realized. The task for us is to see how we can use traditional wisdom to save the planet and be healthy in sisterhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhanu. That was very helpful. Let me just check in with Jen. Is there anything that you would like to say? You need to unmute, my friend, or a question that you have at the top of your head.
Not really. I don't really have a question. I was just wondering about Bhanu and how her cooking and relationship to food is different in Norway and in India.
Yeah. Norway is, of course, a meat-eating country. There's a lot of meat, non-vegetarian food. And but I would say that these days you have access to a lot of vegetables. You have access to a lot of lentils, and even if you calculate the climate miles and the gases that we release in the atmosphere are so little if you have a diet which contains lentils and beans that gives protein, healthy protein in your diet, along with all the seasonal vegetables and fruits. And of course, we have other gadgets. We have freezers, and so I think that people, I feel here are totally, they are at a loss. Many think that the market has to supply. them good vegetarian food so they can go buy and eat. But that doesn't lead you to self-reliance or making your own food, healthy food. So as opposed to India, still, of course, it's more of a burden on women. But they try and make food, most of them, every day, fresh food, mostly. And it's changing a bit also, but I think there's a change coming in India too. Many youngsters want to adopt the traditional way of cooking, adopt traditional wisdom, why and how, and all these things which goes on. So I think, but since I'm living here, I feel that this much towards subsistence thinking and the gift giving aspects from my own perspective, like I can contribute something for the environment and teach people.
Great.
Thank you, Bhanu. Okay, Indigo, do you have any question? Do you have a question for Bhanu?
Yeah, actually, so I'm pretty curious about how are you kind of changing the minds of people to transition away from this kind of very meat-heavy food environment to kind of incorporating more vegetarian options in their diets? And how familiar are you finding, like, do you find that people are familiar with vegetarian options, or do you have to teach them, oh, like, there's this great thing called tempeh,
Yeah, they know about vegetarian food. Many youngsters want to include vegetarian plants and plant products in their diet. And they have many people have an idea that it's boring, this type of food, it doesn't taste good. But with the combination of different spices and the way you make it, there are so many things in how you prepare food. And that surprises people, actually. But I do give them a leaflet with all the recipes. When we finish the course, towards the end, we sit and eat together and discuss how the food is, what it is. I tell them all what is it. But I don't go and don't keep looking, controlling them, of course, whether they are adopting. But the courses seem to be popular. There are quite many who want to attend the course. I don't know whether it wasn't an answer for your question, but yeah.
No,
but I think, we have to just keep doing it. If you don't do it, then, you can always say sustainability, and then you eat local products, you eat a lot of meat. It's okay. We don't need to go into that, but this is another alternative. There is an alternative. They've also found that if the whole world turns vegetarian, you can feed 9 billion people, sorry, on the planet. There's no scarcity of food.
Yeah, like the scarcity is such a false pretense, right? We already are producing, just the United States alone wastes a third of all of the food it produces, right? That's not to be said about what other countries as well, but this waste is particularly because we're creating an artificial scarcity mindset. Like the corporations are creating this artificial scarcity mindset, which is not conducive to food security or nutrition or, the well-being of, the constituents. It's primarily to create profit and to create this sense that, oh, there's not enough for all of us. Even though there's always been an abundance. If we scaled back our current agricultural systems by, I think I recently read a statistic in a report I think if we scaled back our food systems by 40 to 50%, we would still have enough to feed the entire world twice over.
Mm. Yeah. And also I realized another totally different aspect when you start cooking, when you go into the kitchen. And this thrift, for example, like my grandmother and her mother who followed in the kitchen. They never wasted anything. They used all parts of a broccoli, for example. The stem was used. These kind of things, you know, there's a lot of money to save, for example, for young families, and you know, and you don't lose all the nutrient values of a vegetable or a fruit. So this sort of is lacking, you know, like somehow it is not, you have to do home science, it's just looked down upon. There was a subject called home science. You can take a bachelor in home science. In India it was, I don't know whether it was in the US, but or other places, but and there you learned all this home economics and yeah.
Yeah, we did too.
Yeah, they had home economics at my high school, but I never saw it like present in higher education other than high school. You know, it was like it wasn't present in a lot of colleges either. Because at that point they're like, oh, you're an adult, you'll figure it out. And then like the majority of college kids are eating ramen, right? Like box ramen. And I can't say I wasn't one of them. You know, it was cheap, it was accessible, and it felt like I was getting the nutrients I had because I had that chicken flavor, and I thought, oh, I'm getting the protein I need, right? Which is not the case.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
like
another thing was that it's good that you mentioned Cuba, you know, at that time, that crisis, when people produced their own food, there was no lack of, I mean, this kind of, they had nutritious food. They produced all these vegetables and fruits. Although, I mean, they might not have had a high economical standard of life, but they had the basic needs to for good health and nourishment. And at the same time, the earth also was happy, I guess.
absolutely. Like, I mean, I did a report on the agroeconomic state of Cuba back in 2024, and there's been such a push on self-reliant food systems. They're actually doing seed sharing cooperatives and programs that really, you know, break the barriers against what we think we can, like what we think we're capable of within our communities to share seeds and create self-reliance. It's because our food systems are inundated with Monsanto, Bayer, you know, all of these big pharma companies that are like, oh, let's try out food. And that create seeds. Sorry.
Yeah. When it comes to seeds, it's
Yeah.
women who have the knowledge which seed, when to plant. She is the one who preserves the seeds, collects the seeds during the end of the season, and saves it for the next season. And if in the community, if somebody had lost all their seeds, they will sort of give them a loan. So they pay back when they have enough seeds. So in small communities, people normally don't go hungry. They take care of each other.
Yeah. And we actually see in certain high-level fora, we see that there's a recognition that Indigenous women specifically play a very key role in seed saving and protecting agricultural biodiversity. And so they recognize this, yet there's no actual mechanisms for ensuring that it's protected, that these women are protected, that these practices are protected. And this is why I call for like cross-sectoral collaboration, because it's not only a food systems issue, this is also a cultural heritage issue, right? This is something about preserving life and traditions for years to come. And seeds, yes, and seeds and plants, yes, they're temporary to some degree, right? If we're consuming them, right? But it's something that's intergenerational, that protects the generation's health going into, you know, whatever next generations they produce.
Many organizations which work with communities, they help them develop seed banks. Navdanya is one example, and then I visited this Deccan society where women had their own seeds in particular areas where they had saved seeds for the next season. You see, and these seed banks, like if you take Palestine, for example, the seed banks have been destroyed. Everything is gone. And they have uprooted all the olive trees, old olive trees. The basis of life is gone. Luckily, many of the seeds are in the gene banks. But I hope that it comes out and people can start using them. But that's a whole different issue again, you know, and the seed banks and who controls and how these systems work, how the United Nations body, yeah. So that in that way, the seeds from Syrian Gene Bank, Syria was one of the centers for arid research institute. So they had all these arid seeds, especially chickpeas. We're doing a lot of research there, a lot of seeds, gene banks. That was moved again to the big gene bank in Norway, in the north.
Thank you, Indigo and Bhanu. Let me check in with Liliana and see if there are questions. Liliana, you can go first.
Yes, there's a question about who decides what is a good plant, like why roses are more important than dandelions. It's like there's a class system within the plants. It's for both of you. Who decides that and why is that? Was my question clear?
Yeah, I think if you take the modern societies, roses are sold in the horticultural shops where they sell all kinds of roses and everything. So it's a profit-giving roses. But dandelion is not. It's a weed. It grows on its own. It doesn't demand anything. It's there. Just give me a little bit space and I will survive, bloom. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, sorry. Were you going?
please. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to add on to this. So, I mean, of course, it comes down to who decides what's valuable in society, right? And that's often the people in power. That's often the people who have kind of curried power over, you know, hundreds of years. We actually see, you know, a lot of what determines plants, which plants are valuable, are based on how easy it is to profit off of it, first of all. And second of all, how easy it is to appropriate, right? Like we see that, I mean, we're all familiar with quinoa now. Quinoa was not a huge thing, you know, back in, I mean, maybe 20, 30 years ago. But it was appropriated from its original Brazilian context and then adapted into multiple different, adapted so it could be grown into multiple different, in multiple different agricultural contexts, right? So it can be grown in various environments, and they genetically mutated the seed so it would be more hardy and so it wouldn't reproduce and be saved, right? And that's the point where food becomes a commodity. When you bioengineer a seed to not be able to be saved to reproduce, right? This is what this is a very, very big contentious problem within food systems right now, is that corporations have taken private property rights or intellectual property rights and placed them on seeds. And that's why, you know, farmers are constantly facing legal battles because, you know, some seeds from Monsanto flew into their field and now they're growing these seeds that they didn't even intend to grow, right? So this intellectual property placed on nature itself, placed on something that we rely on to survive, has been incredibly detrimental. And this started with colonialism, right? When we started seeing plantations arise and cash crops really becoming kind of the center of how we're gonna, you know, make our global economy. And then it transitioned into this kind of capitalist neoliberal aspect. I'm sorry? Okay. But yeah, so it was this key kind of turning point within food systems when seeds started to be commodified, when this knowledge was lost from the original growers, and then they adapted it because they had the ability, they had the technology, they had the finances to genetically engineer it for their purposes.
And that's also the reason why we are concentrating on a few species in food production.
Mm.
So everybody is made to eat this, even the animals, domestic animals too.
Well,
Thank you. Let me check in with Judith and see if there's a question from Judith.
Lisa asks, can seeds be saved by anyone? Is there a way to save them so they don't die or dry out until planting time? Is there a science to saving seeds?
Bhanu, would you
Yeah.
like to respond to that first?
It depends. I mean, you can save seeds if you want to. And these days, there are many people who can help you with how to save the seeds, how to keep them alive. It depends on what scale you would like to save these seeds and what your intention is. Is it a large scale farming, or is it home gardening? There are several things. But so I would guess in a home gardening situation, it would be easy to survive, to save seeds. And now there are many forums in many countries where people bring their seeds during the spring season and share them. They exchange these seeds and grow them in their gardens or in their allotments. I don't know if I've answered the question fully, but yeah.
Thank you, Bhanu. Indigo, do you have anything you'd like to offer to that?
Yeah, so I mean, from my research specifically, we find that, of course, Indigenous women are such huge, I guess, protectors of the seed biodiversity we see today and seed saving, right? Most of the seeds that we do see in the facility Bhanu was talking about have been preserved by women, by Indigenous women. We see it within the gift economy. There were seed saving practices before they would have been like banned or outlawed or genocided in some cases, right? And it's a tragedy, but there is a way to bring back a lot of these seeds too if we revive these traditional practices, if we bring back traditional knowledge and recenter it in our practices. And this looks like, incorporating and encouraging more women and people with diverse worldviews who have been practicing with seed saving and seed sharing into spaces where decision making is the primary point of whatever meeting or community gathering it might be. By incorporating those voices, we see the diverse perspectives. We're able to make actionable plans in order to ensure their protection and their ongoing perpetuation.
I have another example, a very good example. In an organization I visited, they had this biodiversity festival. It happens once a year after the harvest, and it goes on for a whole month. And this is an area where it's a dry area in the south of India, and they grow largely millets. And these women have cultivated millets for the past 25 years, and they have become independent. They save the seeds, and they have a lot of knowledge. And they have also gained their status through this kind of initiatives, organizational work. But during the festival, they have these bullock carts, and they have all kinds of millets decorated around, and they have some bottles of millets and all. And they go from village to village for a whole month. Different carts go around, and people come and talk with each other. They share the knowledge of what grows. And this is one of the ways where traditional knowledge is easily shared among different communities, and also eventually the resource too. And this culminates after a month in the festival where people join together and have a big feast, for example.
Thank you, Bhanu. I'll just say something about seed saving. I lived in a permaculture community for several years, and my parents also were immigrants from the Philippines, and cultivated an organic garden starting in the 1950s, before organic was popular. I have old little magazine from my dad, I think the original Organic Gardener magazine. Seed saving is just common. You know, you have to understand the life cycle of a plant. If you are really wanting to actually become one in relationship to the land and your food, and the perspective, I've said this many times before, on our salons, the creation story of the Philippines from the people that I come from cultivates strength and beauty. So we're not just cultivating food that are plants that are seeds. We also are cultivating the environment itself. The Philippines has very radical weather. So we have to understand how to actually cultivate trees for protection and actually put in living barriers to protect food sources from difficult weather. So in terms of seeds, when you begin to earnestly plant a garden, one of the things that we did, we learned as a permaculturist, was you plant food and then you leave enough to actually go to seed. Because if you don't allow things to go to seed, you don't have seed to collect for the next season. So the only time we ever really purchased seeds, we purchased heritage seeds that were really, original seeds that had a lineage. And then, of course, organic seeds, because there were any genetically modified seeds were often not viable after 1 or 2 seasons. So you want to just make sure what you're planting, and then you cultivate that. In your local area, there are lots of places that will teach you about seed saving. Your local organizations about permaculture. Diane put in the chat about the Austin Public Library. People are constantly once or twice a year exchanging seeds. So if you don't have seeds of one type, you can just put them out and you can go collect what other people have, because there's so many different varieties of tomatoes and other things. When my parents landed in Palm Springs, or arrived in Palm Springs, where I grew up, there wasn't an Asian store close enough, like 2 hours away. So what they would do is they would buy fruits and vegetables at the market, and then they would save the seeds from the fruit or the vegetable, and then they would germinate the seeds and plant them. Eventually, my mother grew 80 malunggay or moringa trees in our backyard. We had a forest of trees, and that plant. Pardon me?
In the US?
Yes, in the US. Yeah, they're very easy to grow, but it's a plant that's rich in protein. It's a tree. It's fast growing. It's very biodiverse in the way that you can use medicinal from the stalk all the way to the leaves, for the flowers and the fruit itself. Anyways, it's easy to propagate once it's a tree. So these are just things that when you begin to work with plants, they become your friends, really. They're plant people. So you want to have a relationship with them and understand what their growth and cycle needs are. So yeah, seeds are very easy to collect. They need to dry out. You don't want seeds wet, but you want to be able to, have your seeds be viable, which means you want it. you definitely want them dry because you don't want them to get mold. So those are just my thoughts about that. And
Can I just add something?
many people who actually, we've had lots of people moving around the planet, and many of the immigrants that I know, people have actually brought seeds from their own country because they want to plant their own food. The foods that they're used to actually cooking that you actually can't get in grocery stores in the United States. So, you know, it's not unusual for people to have seeds from their own countries. Yes,
Can I
Bhanu.
just add to that? Yeah, that's three things here. The last thing, I'll take the last thing first. People brought seeds from their home countries and all, but today it's not possible. Everything has to go through stringent check. They're not allowed to carry whatever seeds, animal products into the country without informing the authorities. And that's also partly due to the monoculture cultivation in the United States today. It's also in Australia and New Zealand. That's one thing. And then you're talking about this moringa. And moringa is also extremely healthy and it contains a lot of iron. And I read that in the Philippines, there was an area where a lot of moringa grew. And there were particular parrot species which were eating the fruits of this moringa plant. So when the moringa plant disappeared from that area, these birds disappeared too. Then they introduced moringa and the birds came back. So it was really a lovely, story.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not uncommon that animals will disappear when their environment disappears. You know, so, you know, what their food sources are. So that's why we actually need to make sure that we take care of the environment, the sustainability of the entire planet, not just what's necessary food for humans, you know. Yeah.
Absolutely. And sorry.
Yes, please.
Okay. I was going to say also, like, I mean, the primary reason that we see a loss of animal biodiversity is because of agricultural expansion to kind of uphold this productionist imperative that's placed on that's placed on our land, right? Where we're trying to just produce more and more and more to feed these animals in what we call CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, where you see like all of the cows kind of lined up in a very tight way, or you know, where you see all of the chickens in crates where they can't move. You know, those are confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, and this lack of interaction with their environment, of course, reduces the nutritional value we receive from them, and it also has a detrimental effect on the environment, not just from their emissions from being kind of in crowded, tight spaces, but also because they're not, you know, in their natural habitats protecting the species that they have been protecting for hundreds of years before they were domesticated and put into these, you know, very highly populated operations. Right, they're not serving their original purpose, for their evolutionary purpose. And I know there's people who are trying to, like, you know, revive previous genetics of animals, and so they have, you know, higher nutritional content and all of that. But that gets into an ecofeminist talk on vegetarian and vegan food ethics that I can get into for an hour. But it's this abandonment of their original environments that it's not conducive to actually preserving the biodiversity in our food systems. Like, often we see rotational farming is probably one of the best things that we can do for grazing animals, right? And for protecting our local biodiversity and protecting, you know, the plants that, you know, they end up eating, you know, fertilizing the next round, right? But so rotational farming isn't practiced because it's too expensive or not enough people know about it, or like farmers are often too remote because they're working on vast swaths of monocropped land.
Yeah, Yes, I think one of the things that I've noticed when permaculture was introduced 30 years ago to me, a lot of those lands are actually now sustainable. And there are so many more people worldwide who are understanding permaculture really is indigenous practices that are really indigenous to the local land. It's understanding how to be in place and how to actually work with the seasons specific and unique to your area, planting both indigenous and exotics, meaning what will enhance the soil. It's always growing the soil. It's not just about feeding. It's not just about creating biodensity. It's having the soil thrive. Having good soil means an alive planet, you know. And I think that movement, which was from the bottom up, is meeting now agriculture, you know, the industrial agriculture that is trying to impose from the top down. But when we look at the way in which indigenous communities who have had their contiguous practices of planting and managing their land are, you know, our support is necessary to be able to align with them to ensure that their local biodiversities are actually protected and saved, and not impose upon them an idea of what you know the globalists would want, because they've sort of had this great idea of how we can, you know, feed the planet now, and try to impose that on indigenous people. They've been living, you know, for thousands of years, 30,000 years, 60,000 years. They have a legacy that continues, you know. So it's very arrogant to try to impose an ideology onto them, to tell them that they need to have this ideology because they need to you know, they, or else they'll die. Basically, they die because capitalism, patriarchy, and the extractive expressions that are anti-gift are actually killing them.
And
Yeah.
seeds are gifts, you see. You're given a gift when you go meet indigenous peoples. You get a gift of seeds. So,
let me check in with Jen. Did you want to say something?
I was
Yes.
just, you all made me think of animals that are being industrially raised, and it's a tremendous cruelty. And don't they just go crazy in these pens and things where they're cages where they're kept?
Yeah. So there's actually, I took a course on it. And well, it wasn't specifically on it, but this was a very large part of it. And in confined animal feeding operations, we see that the mental health of the animals is often not taken into account. And there's a very dualistic way of looking at, okay, how healthy is the animal in this environment? Right. So on one end, it's the physical health. The second end is the mental health. Physical health is often prioritized in these environments, even though the mental affects the physical, right? There's not this interchange of knowledge between it, because they siloed these two ideas of what health looks like for these animals. And of course, we like as humans don't understand how animals can conceive of thoughts and how they perceive the world, you know, and what they think of their environments. But it is very obvious in specifically like hog feeding operations in North Carolina. Like, I mean, it's the hog capital of the U.S. But in like mass-produced pork confined feeding operations, we see that, I mean, they're not even given enough space to move like forward or backward. They're put into these like little rectangular kind of boxes where they're only able to lay down to let the piglets suckle, right? And in chicken feeding operations, we also see, I mean, chickens are often put in cages, or they're put into what they can call pasture raised, because they have a certain amount that they're able to walk around. right? But they're not getting enough sunlight, so they're not producing high quality eggs, and they're not getting enough access to like the food and water that they need because they're being so heavily fattened by the food that they do eat that they can no longer walk and that they're losing all of their feathers. And so we see these horrible, inhumane treatments happening all over the world when it comes to food systems, specifically in meat. And there's accountability mechanisms for treating animals this poorly, not related to their mental health, but their physical health. There's a lot of accountability mechanisms across the world for this legally, yet corporations are able to lobby so much power within the governments of the member states that they operate within, that when you have blackmail on a politician, what's the politician going to do, right? They're definitely not going to hold you accountable for producing meat in a very unethical way, and they're also concerned about their constituents no longer having access to those foods if you retaliate, right, as a politician.
It's similar with cattle also. I mean, they are not able to stand these cows. They cannot stand. They're just given food, and they are supposed to milk and continuously. But also this thinking, that we only think of how much protein does it give. It's the same thing in a crop, how much of carbohydrate or whatever is produced. So what happens when you cultivate it in this fast cultivation or whatever, then these nutritional substances in the resource can be of an imbalance. Then you have to start introducing other things, like with gene manipulation techniques, and so there's a whole. It's the way you think, like what is it important? This is what you don't care about what happens to these animals or the plants or the other diversity around you. It's only
the people are crazy, not the, and then they make the animals crazy. I guess that's it.
Yeah.
Actually, cattle when they eat, I believe that they sit down and relax, and that is a healthy sign.
Yeah, they do. That's right. Yeah.
But in this industrial husbandry, there's no place. They have to stand all the time.
Yeah. I remember a film I saw. So some women had produced of chickens, that they kept the chickens free in their garden, and the chickens had a wonderful life, and just as opposed to the chickens that were captured inside of those boxes and things. It was very cool that they did that.
And often, so much of the disconnect we have from this production system, a lot of people know that this is happening within confined animal feeding operations, but they don't think about it. And there's an amazing paper I can share with you. And it's primarily about how we're trying to mentally separate ourselves from the cruelty, right? It's kind of, we're going through mental gymnastics because we're no longer, and the production system itself is kind of enabling this because we're not seeing the full body of the animal when we eat it, right? We're seeing it dissected into, parts, right? We're not buying a chicken, we're buying chicken breasts. We're not buying a cow, we're buying, a piece of ribeye, right? There's a cognitive dissonance, right? We don't really fully register it as this is once a living being because it comes in such a clean, sanitized package. And we don't see that this was an animal with a life. We never connected with it. And the ways that we can connect with them are so distant and disparate. But, that's why it's so important to build a relationship with your local farmer, because they're going to tell you the name of the cow and that it lived a happy life, and that, that you're eating something that was well taken care of and that wasn't going crazy, right?
Yeah. I think it's also true of even just vegetables, plants and fruits and nuts. When I lived in the permaculture community, I had people from Los Angeles come to visit us and see our garden. And these were adults. So they were in their, mid to late 20s, mid to late 30s. I had people who were walking around and asked, what is that? Because they never saw a fruit or a vegetable that was actually grown on a plant. And so they didn't recognize it. They had no relationship with the food that they ate whatsoever. They had no idea. And I remember the first time I was in Brazil, or the only time I was in Brazil, and I didn't understand. I had never seen a cashew, how a cashew was grown. And I was just so shocked to see that the cashew that I ate grew outside of the fruit, that it wasn't a seed that was inside the fruit. I mean, there are so many amazing, incredible things about the way in which life grows itself and creates itself. And but it is a tragedy. And I think in the Los Angeles school district, one of the things that they did that was really wonderful for the children was to have the children actually grow plants in their classes so that children could actually see what would happen with a seed, and growing vegetables so that they could actually see, oh, they could actually eat them. Because when I was growing up, that wasn't something that was done in the 50s or 60s. We didn't grow vegetables at school, we were Tang. I don't know if you know Tang, and Jello, powdered fake orange juice that went into space, and Jello and Kool-Aid. I mean, come on. That is like, it wasn't even fruit juice. Anyway, so things, while it seems things are going in one direction, it's hard to say because many good things have come out of that bad experience, and it's hard to make a generalization. But yeah, there's lots of wonderful options. Let me just check in with Liliana and see. Liliana, do you have another question?
Yes, I have a question from Cristina Herencia. And she says, two aspects that have been left out from the very appreciated presentation of both sisters is the sacredness of food and the community embedding of food production, where women's participation is key, which the native Indian culture civilization stands. It has been called La civilización del alimento, the food civilization, for it is responsible for about 40% of what the world presently consumes today. It still has many lessons to share with the world with respect to what food is a blessing. I can repeat the question.
No, I think you were pretty clear. Do Bhanu or Indigo, would you like to talk about, respond to that comment or talk about the sacredness of food? Bhanu, you're unmuted. Would you like to go first? You're unmuted. You can.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. No, I mean, sacredness of food. This is part of the whole issue of food. You cannot separate this. It is part of sharing, and it is like in the Indian tradition, you can say that always there are some offerings to the gods before you have the food. You share it among whoever is there present. So that is the sacredness. Whoever comes, you give them food, water. Even if in the hot summers, you will find people are giving you a glass of water, because this is part of the tradition. And this comes from, I would say that the cultures which we have grown from, sharing whatever we have. You go to temples, you have this sacredness, offerings to the gods. And then it's distributed among the devotees who are present in the temples. And like the biodiversity festival, I said, there also there is a feast, a sacredness, and people sit together and eat. So seeds are definitely sacred.
Do you see any of that in Norway? Any elements of the sacredness of food since you've been in Norway? Any of their ancient practices, because some of those people are quite indigenous from that land.
Yeah, it used to be many, I mean, maybe 100 years ago, the church, like the Halloween time now, which is soon approaching, they used to have all these, whatever they cultivated, the wheat straw and everything, they used to come decorate in the churches. People used to know, people used to bring them to the church, and before they had the celebration. But it's all gone. I don't think people know about it.
They don't have any secular harvest festivals or anything that goes on?
No, nowadays there are sort of, you have these organizations which have, I mean, which are celebrating, what should I say? But not in that sense. I haven't come across.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Indigo? You have anything you want to offer to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of ties back into a lot of the points we were making, and that the commodification of food, I mean, is largely due to colonization and capitalist extractivism and destruction, and this patriarchal hierarchization, I hope I pronounced that right, of, you know, what foods we value and don't value. And so much of what has been determined as non-valuable is Indigenous women's knowledge. And this knowledge is not just passed down because it's useful, it's also because it's sacred. And it's also because it's led to the preservation of their environment, their relationship to the environment and their relationship to each other for hundreds and thousands of years, you know? And I mean, we do see kind of some recognition of this in high-level policymaking. We see specifically the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. They partnered with UNESCO to label food agricultural heritage sites across the world. Often, so a point that I make in my thesis is that none of these are actually from matriarchal societies, or they're not identified as matriarchal. And we specifically know that, I mean, the potato production in South America, I think it was the Inca population in Peru, they developed a very scientific and technical knowledge to produce hundreds of varieties of potatoes that are still eaten today, right? And I mean, a lot of people don't know about this because they're like, oh, all I need is my russet potato and my mini potatoes and I'm happy, you know, or my fingerlings, you know. But they don't think about, okay, so there was so much history that goes into this food that was upheld because it was sacred to people, because people believed that this was their way of connecting with the world and that they believed they were one with the world. And I mean, often, you know, Indigenous societies still do through the food they eat, right? Like what I was talking about before, your food is part of your cultural identity. It creates a sense of belonging within your community. What you eat can determine whether or not you're part of an in-group or an out-group in many cases, anthropologically. And when you're eating food that's part of an in-group, there's also the development of, you know, a kind of sacred practices and traditions around it.
Especially
Yes.
the freeze-dried potatoes in the Incas. When they harvested potatoes, they dug them in the ground in sacks and left it during the winter. It was there until a year or so. And then they started using it. And it could stay for a very long time. It doesn't get spoiled.
Mm.
So that is their knowledge of using the resource.
Well, I thought I would offer, this is Latapati. She's a Filipino harvest and fertility goddess, fertility of the earth, not necessarily of for humans, but also for humans. And this is a carving. The Philippines doesn't have any ancient images of their deities. The weather is very severe. This is probably from the 1960s, but this is a fertility harvest goddess. So she has lots of fruits in her basket, and that's definitely a sacred aspect of food, honoring her and the offerings that are done to her. So thank you for asking about the sacredness of food. I get to show this Filipino goddess.
And another thing is, if you take the medicinal plants, for example, in India, you have what is called a sacred groves, where the local people, local communities grew medicinal plants. And they did a study on these sacred groves. And they found out rare medicinal plants full of diversity. And these plants could not be just, anybody could not go and just take whatever they wanted. They had to take permission. But this is to safeguard that the resource is for everybody. There's a lovely story behind it. It's a religious story, but I can tell you if you want to listen to it. There's this big the story about Rama, and you must have heard of this. Rama and his brother, they were banished to the forest. So Rama was with his wife and his brother. And the wife was kidnapped by one of the kings of Sri Lanka, and she was imprisoned in the garden. And then one of the helpers of Rama, he's this monkey god. He says, I'll go and find her. And he finds her, he finds her in the garden of the palace of this king in Sri Lanka. And then there's a war going on. Now they say, now we have to rescue the wife. So there are many animals which help these gods and these armies of apes and other animals. They cross over, they build a bridge, they cross over to Sri Lanka, and there's a big war going on. And then Rama's brother is hit. And then they say now he needs a particular plant which is only found in the Himalayas. So how do we get that? So the monkey god, Hanuman, he says, I can fly. And he flies. So when he reaches that place, he forgets the name of the plant. And so what he does is he just takes the whole mountain. So if you see this picture of monkey god flying like this with the mountain in the hand, so while he was flying over India, I believe bits and pieces of that mountain fell here and there and became sacred groves. So now in the tropical forest areas in the western side of India, there are many sacred groves with rare medicinal plants and rich biodiversity, biodiverse region. And by the time he reached, even the smell of the mountain, the smell of the herb cured him. He woke up. That is the story. It's an interesting story, you know. So, I mean, you can also see that the sacred groves which came into being and people going to study, and then they find that these are repositories of rare and medicinal plants, and it is high in diversity, these areas. And probably that is also was said that so that people don't go and destroy these. They had this, they had to think twice before. Yeah.
Thank you, Bhanu. Let me check in with Judith and see if Judith has another question for us.
We're coming up to Canadian Thanksgiving, and the food banks are using the language of gifting to ask people to donate turkeys so that they can provide turkey dinners to everybody for Thanksgiving. And I just wonder if you would like to comment on the concept and practice of food banks and how that fits into what you've been talking about.
So particularly, I think food banks are highly contested in that are they from a political standpoint, they receive so much backlash because they're like, oh, it's just making people dependent, and there's all this, very conservative rhetoric about it. But then on the other hand, it's almost like an imitation of what we're trying to bring back with like food as commons, right? It's like it's a very faithful attempt. But it doesn't quite hit the need, right? Because there are still people who are food insecure. There's still people who aren't aware that these food banks exist. And these food banks might only be donated to by, people who are like just emptying out the back of their pantry, so they're not getting the foods that, like the people who, go to these food banks aren't getting the high quality foods that other people have access to in the community. And I think in particular, like to comment on the in Canada the way they use gift your turkeys. Like I think, I mean, it's possible that this is I mean I'm a little bit pessimistic about this use of the language because I think it could be misconstrued in a way where it's like, okay, so this is what the gift economy means, right? It means I'm giving a turkey to a food bank, and that's I'm doing my part for my community, and I'm participating in the gift economy when it's actually something much more broad. And I also think, I mean, we've seen a lot of instances of appropriation of Indigenous cultures and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous language by high-level policymakers. And I mean, not even just high level. We've seen a lot of appropriation of this language, and it detaches it from its original context. So I would be hesitant to say, oh, this is like a panacea, right? Or panacea. But I think it's a faithful effort to try and restore what we had community-wise. But this patriarchal kind of narrative is still part of it because it's like, oh, let's give to people lesser than. Let's give to people who have less, and I'm doing my part.
Bhanu, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No.
Okay. What comes to mind to me has to do with, well, I'll just out myself. Today, I celebrate 26 years ordained as a Dianic high priestess. And one of the books I read was called Daughters of the Goddess, the Sacred Priestess, Going Back to Sacred Food. And one of the things that it talked about was, the people who did ritual, the offerings that were given to the temple itself were actually redistributed for the community. So they became repositories actually of sacred offerings that were returned to the people as in need. And that was one of the reasons that when I met Genevieve, I realized that, oh, well, I'm a priestess. My ancient roots were in this aspect of actually gift giving, that we were the people who were the agency between spirit and matter. And anything that we received was not for us, it was for our whole community. And so the redistribution was to ensure that nobody went hungry, and that it was actually given and blessed both ways, blessed to us and then blessed as it went returned to the people itself. So for me, that is also part of the sacred as a holistic orientation. The Filipino people are animistic. So, we feel that we're part of the earth. We are nature herself walking on two legs, and everything is related to us. So we're always thanking in gratitude anything that we take from the forest or is given to us by fruit trees, et cetera, et cetera. I tend to believe that would have been common with any people if you go back far enough into your lineage of how you related to the food in the forest, the plants and the animals themselves. the water, the fish, and everything. So, Judith, I think that what Indigo was talking about in terms of we're trying to sort of bring back something. And Jen always reminds us that we're in a transitional place, and food banks are essential for people who are really struggling. And if you can gift, it is a way that you can gift with your whole heart, knowing that we're in this transitional place, and then do the work to actually shift the paradigm so that the gift economy actually arises in its strongest form. So yeah, that's what I'd like to say about that. Yeah. Jen, do you have anything you'd like to offer about food banks and things like that as a transitional? It's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, when people are hungry, they need to eat,
Yeah.
so and we need to do it. However, people have been doing charity for many, many years, and churches have been doing it, and the economy has remained a market economy, a capitalist economy. It hasn't changed the paradigm. So we need to keep on doing the food banks while we change the whole structure of the way the economy works.
Exactly. And institute an educational awareness, like Indigo was sharing with us, that it has to happen on many levels. It can't just happen on one level to be able to shift the paradigm. Each of the sort of segments of culture have their own language that they're speaking when they're doing their work, and they're part of shifting the paradigm. So you started out by saying at the global level, there's a whole thing that has to happen there, but at a local level, there's a whole different thing that has to happen there. And they kind of have to shift, they have to kind of meet before the paradigm shifts.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about the way small children, babies, are nurtured, that they can only be nurtured unilaterally by their caregivers or their mothers, because they can't give anything back. So they don't have an exchange. And that kind of unilateral gift giving continues throughout our lives, and we don't recognize it because we're so much into exchange and the market and capitalism. But it's there underneath in a lot of our logical processes and our interpersonal processes. And well, I think there's just a basic structure underneath underneath our consciousness that is based in giving and receiving. So that's what I've been thinking about a lot. And I think that if we could notice that and see it, and we would really revise our concept of who we are. And we need to do that in order to stop doing the terrible things that we're doing. So, because we need to do gift giving instead of wars. We need to be doing gift giving instead of destroying the environment, and instead of creating nuclear bombs. So that's yeah.
Thanks, Jen. Let me check in with Judith and see if she has another question for us.
I do most of my shopping at the farmers market, and I eat very intentionally. And I'm wondering what, and I always offer gratitude for not only to the cooks, but also to Mother Earth for providing the food, and to the farmers who grew the food, and to the people who transported the food. And I will now add, thank you, Indigo, to the policymakers who support local farming. And I'm wondering what else people can do on the individual level in order to move this change in the paradigm forward.
Indigo? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things you can do. And honestly, I consider myself an inclusive environmentalist, right? And what that inherently means is that you can only do your best. Your best is all you can do, right? If you do not have the financial the financial resources to make a sustainable decision every time you make a decision, that is entirely fine. At least you're trying to make that, and at least you're aware of that, and at least you're telling your community, your friends, your family about this, right? I mean, of course, shopping at farmers markets is a great option, right? But, not everybody can afford farmers markets. That's why we need to, kind of amplify our voices to our local communities, and to, like, it is really easy to contact your local politicians in many cases, and say, hey, my community needs a community garden because half of us are not getting access to fresh fruits and vegetables, right? Can we use this empty plot of land and just develop something here? It's a lot of this is so much more accessible than they want you to believe, right? They want you to believe that this is hard to do, that you're entrenched in this way of living, when that's not the truth. You're allowed to make small changes in your everyday life and become closer with people through food. And that could also look like going to your local restaurant that you always notice is empty, right? That's also supporting your local food system, and smaller businesses, right? There's also, the opportunity to volunteer at farms. We have, I mean, there's a huge worldwide program called WWOOFing. And I think it's like WWOOF. I forget what it actually stands for, but you can volunteer on farms and they can provide you with housing or food, or, whatever you need, depending on what the program is, for, a designated amount of time that you can agree with them upon. And that's how you kind of build community, build that connection to your local food systems. Educating yourself is also incredibly important. Educating yourself about where your food comes from, who produced your food, why they're producing your food. And getting to know the people who produce your food is insanely important. Also, reading up on it, like, you can read authors like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who, like, I mean, she's really popular for this book called Braiding Sweetgrass, right? And then she just came out with another book called The Gift Berry, something along the lines of The Gift Berry. Yeah.
Serviceberry.
Yes, the service berry, that's what it is. So, reading up on how you can introduce the gift into your own life, into your own, in small ways in your own life, is another great way to just, move this forward. Because the more that people know, the more your community knows, the more that you're sharing this with people, developing a passion for it.
Thanks, Indigo. Bhanu, do you have anything that you offer to people to help them get more involved with food at a local level? I know you write a column.
Yeah.
That is, are there ways that you inspire people and you teach people? So
Yeah, that's the way I do it right now. So, yeah, it's a job on the side. So, trying to, yeah.
And are these classes that you offer occasionally, and people come and you offer classes? Can you give us an example of a class that you might teach?
Yeah, we have I make a leaflet and I plan whatever I'm going to make, different recipes. So, and then we have about 12 to 15 people who can join. Otherwise, there's no place for more. And then everybody is involved in some part of the work. It's not just I who's standing there, and people can watch. So it's more very interactive. So whenever we make the food, everybody is there and asking questions. How is this made? And I also explain, why do you use this? Why should you not use this? Why is it used this way, for example? So that's how I teach. And then towards the end of the course, so we sit together and eat. And there comes many questions. So many people can be surprised by how potato can taste this way, for example, or a carrot can taste differently than what you're used to from before, for example.
Wonderful.
So, yeah. So I always take in both the health aspects and the environmental aspects in discussions while I'm doing teaching.
That's great. Liliana, I think we have time for one more question. Do you have one for us?
I do. I have one from Marta Benavides. And she said, is it a principle of wisdom? Let your food be your medicine. Let your medicine be your food.
Yeah.
Who do we know as having popularized this principle many centuries ago? She's asking, where did this come from? Do anybody knows?
I would say it's an experience-based knowledge, which women have practiced through centuries and passed on this oral knowledge from one generation to another, and that's how this has come about. We have not discovered those documents yet. We may never discover those documents to show, oh, this has also been written down. So at some point of time, But there are many documents like the Chinese medicine and the Indian traditional medicine. There are old texts which have been written about food and medicine. So there's always, if it's the medical tradition, there's not just about medicine. It's also about food and how you live and how you have to go about your life. It takes also into account your psyche, So everything, it's a holistic thinking.
Great.
Thanks, Bhanu. Indigo,
you.
do you have to offer for that?
Yeah, I mean, food as medicine is becoming so much more recognized in high-level policy, which is something that I mean, wouldn't have been possible without, Indigenous advocates specifically within food systems and in these policymaking spaces. And it's something that is very contentious for a lot of member states because there's a lot of profitability in ensuring people stay sick. And when governments are lobbied by big pharma, by big corporations who profit off of our sickness, food as medicine becomes more contentious, and it becomes this kind of taboo thing that people are like, oh, only the holistic hippies do that, right? But we actually see with this presence in higher level policymaking spaces, we actually see a good level of discursive policy translation among what we would consider the more progressive countries or member states, where you actually see it coming up in like medical policy, where like doctors are allowed to diagnose food as medicine for you, right? And that's something that's actually legally like applicable now, and something that's contestable too. If you believe that your sickness is because of your food system, you can go to the doctor and be like, I need a prescription for, healthy food. And I mean, specifically talking about my experience in the farmers markets in Boston, I wasn't a manager during this time, but there was right before the season right before I'd arrived, there was a program where my farmers market organization partnered with one of the biggest hospitals in Boston, and in partnering with them, it was particularly with their seniors program and their senior care units, where doctors could diagnose or prescribe, local fruits and vegetables for your diet, and they'd be able to give you these kind of like bucks, right? These paper slips that you could exchange for fruits and vegetables at the farmers market through this partnership, right? So like I said, it's happening through a multi-scalar level, but food as medicine is, I mean, it's still kind of on that level of like, okay, food is still a commodity. Food is a tool that we use in order to ensure productivity. It's not the paradigm shift hasn't quite happened yet on that level. That mental transformation hasn't happened. So there still needs to be more advocacy for it.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Mary put into the chat, Hippocrates said, let food be your medicine. So I think that's a good place for us to end our session today. It's been very rich and really wonderful. And we got to travel into different aspects of food and really bring the gift paradigm into the conversation and the gender issues into the conversation as women who, are often central to seed saving. So I want to thank you, Indigo and Bhanu, for joining us today and giving your wonderful talks and answering questions and telling stories. They were wonderful. I want to thank Liliana and Judith for answering your questions, for posing the questions, Diane and Lisa for being in the background, and always Genevieve for your brilliance of bringing forward this, incredible notion of the gift economy, this theory and philosophy that is so, so important, that could really make a huge difference in this world. I want to just give you a hint of our upcoming salons. I'm very excited to be able to announce in 2 weeks, we're going to have on Saturday, October the 18th, Men in Matriarchy. We've often talked about matriarchy, different levels, but we've had over the years requests of both women who are raising boys, women who are with men, and men who are asking, well, what about us in matriarchy? So Heidi Gutner Abendroth and Patricia Buchan, who is from, I forget what her people are. Is it the Kasi? Mangala? Mangala. Megala people.
Yeah.
And which her she has a matriarchal lineage and tribe in India. So they will be speaking on October the 18th. Registration is open. Diane put the link in the chat. In 3 weeks from today, Saturday, October the 25th, Lesline de la Madre will introduce her latest book, She Who Spins the Coil of Creation, Sacred Female Cosmology and the Electric Plasma Universe. So I hope you'll come back for that. And we're also really excited because it's been 6 years. It's almost been 6 years. So we're coming up at the end of November, November the 28th, our 6th annual conference. This year, we're focusing on the maternal human. We really are putting ourselves out there and just saying it out loud. We need to shift this paradigm. As Heidi Gutner Abendroth says, matriarchy now. So Genevieve Vaughan, Darshan Navaris, Sherry Mitchell, Pat McCabe, and Mickey Kashkan will be with us. And that link is also open for registration. And that will be quite an interesting and lively conversation. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. And please make sure that you eat very healthy and nutritious food and celebrate today. And thank you for all that you do. Eat well, and may we have peace, everyone, in your heart and in the world. Take good care. Bye for now.